In this video, I'll be reassembling the front end of a naturally aspirated Porsche 944 to finish repairing some accident damage caused by a lower front impact. A couple months ago, I'd spent some time breaking down most of the front end on this car so that it could go in for paint, and I had initially left the headlights and the wiring harness in place, but as I began to think about how the body shop would approach the work on the radiator support, I became a little concerned about overspray. So I decided to remove the headlight buckets, the headlight motor, the ignition coil, and I repositioned the wiring harness out of the way, and then removed the high and low horns and the alternator air duct to completely clear out the front section, and now it should be a lot easier to mask off any components that shouldn't be painted. At that point, I figured I might as well remove the damaged right radiator support bracket, so I performed some surgery with a grinding wheel to cut the bracket away from the frame rail, and then I leveled off the remaining spot welds on the frame. With the old bracket removed, the car was fully prepped to have the new support installed, and because the body shop was backed up by about 6 weeks, I decided to have a mobile welding service stop by in the interim and weld in the new support. That way we're still making some forward progress on the car, and it'll hopefully reduce the turnaround time at the body shop. Well, I just had the new radiator support member installed, and the guys did a great job. They drilled a few holes in the bracket to create some space for the spot welds, and then the factory pattern was mirrored all along the support material. We checked it with a laser level once it was mounted up, and it looks almost perfectly aligned, so I'm really happy with the result. I've got the lower support member mounted as well, and I just had to pull the left bracket in by about a ½ inch to straighten it out. The center divider had buckled a little bit, so I worked on that section with some C-clamps and a 4-inch vise to smooth it out, and after mocking up the radiator in place, everything's lining up nicely. The last thing I'm going to do is apply some seam sealer all around the edges of the new bracket to keep moisture from hanging out in these joints here. And now all the body shop will need to do is dust these brackets with some factory paint color, paint the front bumper and the front spoiler, and we'll be ready for the reassembly. I was able to pick up some seam sealer compound for about $18, and I applied it to the upper and lower seams of the support bracket to seal it off, so we're looking pretty good there. As I was wrapping things up and tying down any loose hoses and cables in the engine compartment, I noticed that the protective rubber boots on the headlight wiring harness connectors were a little cracked and crumbling, so I went ahead and cut some 3/4 inch heat shrink tubing to a length that covered the aging rubber boots, along with a small section of the existing plastic wire loom, and I finished off that installation with a heat gun. That way the wiring will be protected from any moisture and debris while maintaining the integrity of those connections over time. The end product provided the needed protection with a little bit of flexibility left in the cable and improved the overall look of the connectors. After waiting on availability at the body shop for about 6 weeks now, the 944 is finally headed off for the replacement parts to be painted. While that work was being performed, I began repairing the electrical connector on the left cooling fan that had been melted by the power steering pump belt as a result of the radiator support being pushed back into the lower engine. The used replacement fan I picked up was a little noisy when I tested it, so I decided to swap out the plastic connector on the existing fan instead. The top cap of these connectors can be popped off to reveal 2 electrical terminals below that are soldered to the main connection piece. So I desoldered the damaged connector and installed a replacement one with some fresh solder, and after that the fan was working again. At that point I finished off the fan repair by replacing all the rusted washers and nuts on the mounting studs with some new ones. I also took some time to sort through the hundreds of pieces of new hardware I had collected over the past couple months, categorizing all the washers, nuts, bolts, and clamps into individual bags for each stage of the reassembly process. It had taken a while to track down some of these pieces, but it'll be nice to have all new parts replacing the oxidized ones that were on the car previously. After just over a week and a half at the body shop, the paintwork has been completed and I've got the car back in the garage now. Here's a look at some of the freshly painted parts. I've got a brand new OEM front spoiler from Porsche, which was primed from the factory, so the shop didn't have to do too much prep work for this piece. The coat looks nice and uniform throughout, no major runs or anything like that. There are a few small pieces of dust and debris in the clear coat here and there, but it's pretty minor, and I think it has just the right amount of orange peel in the finish, so it won't really stand out amongst the other body panels on the car, so that will be nice. I also had the aluminum front bumper stripped and repainted, and I had them weld over the 2 center holes for the front license plate bracket for a cleaner look up front. There were a couple points on the lower side that had slightly oxidized, so the shop took care of that during the preparation as well, and I'm really happy with how everything turned out. I've also got a replacement body support bracket here for the right side that was repainted in the factory Zermatt silver color. This one turned out a bit glossier than the existing bent, dirty, and faded one that's on the car, but it will largely be out of sight and will certainly get the job done. The radiator support turned out pretty nice as well. They didn't apply tape here just to avoid any hard lines and basically blended it into the other frame components as best they could. But the most important thing is that all the metal is coated and protected from the elements. These undercarriage supports and brackets don't get a full coat of clear like the outer body panels do at the factory anyway. They're just lightly dusted and kind of pick up various amounts of overspray as they're coating the other sections of the engine bay. So the shop tried to mirror that approach with a light coat of clear, and I think once the front end is rebuilt, everything will blend together well. So it's time to get working on the reassembly, and I'm going to start with routing this wiring harness across the front. The wiring harness leads to the central electrical panel, passes through the firewall, and then routes down along this frame rail below the car, pops up out front and splits off into some upper and lower connections, and then comes across the front to the other side on the opposite side of this frame rail to power these accessories here. There are some plastic hangers and some screw-on zip ties that I've replaced, the old broken ones. So let's take a look at these connectors. We've got 2 grounding wires on this side and 2 sets of connectors for the high and low pressure sensors for the AC system. 1 female, 1 male, so you can't really mix them up when you connect them. And power to the headlight. Down below there are some connections for the lighting. This larger plastic connector is for the front turn signal marker in the bumper. And then 2 sets of smaller connectors here. This larger gauge will be for the fog light, and the smaller set is for the side marker in the front spoiler. And the brown wire on these will be the ground. The other one will be the positive. We've also got some connectors for cooling fan motors that run over in this direction, and 2 connectors for the high and low tone horns that are sitting up here. On the other side, we've got those same lighting connectors down below. And then above we have a plastic connector for the headlight motor, connection for ignition coil. Positive is the black, green is the ground. There are 2 connectors for the washer fluid system. This longer one will go to this motor for the washer fluid, and the shorter one, if you have a headlight washer system, the reservoir is a little bit bigger and you'll have a secondary motor to connect up that second one that I don't have. Another headlight connection and a grounding point connects here. So I'm going to get everything tied down and clean up the grounds, and I've also got to replace the power connector for cooling fan motor number 2 that was shredded by the power steering pump belt. So I've got a replacement that I can splice in and get that fixed up. And once that's all squared away, I can install the replacement horns that I've got and the alternator air duct up front. Now that the front wiring harness has been properly tightened down and the cooling fan power connector replaced, I'm going to begin replacing the horns at the front corner here. There are a couple different setups for these horns. On the earlier cars, they were positioned side by side on a little cross brace back here. And on this later car, this one's tucked back and this one's positioned facing downward. This is the low tone horn and this is the high tone horn. And I initially had repainted these, I was going to reuse them, but this one had rusted so badly from the inside out that it split the housing, and when I tested it, it wasn't functioning. So I've got 2 new replacement horns, and they have updated this part a little bit. It's a slightly different form factor, it's more condensed, but they work the same way. So we'll get this one tucked back here and the second one facing downward over here. And these are not polarity sensitive, so you can connect them up any way you want. As long as they're connected, they'll work. So we'll get those installed. And then I'm going to install the alternator air duct up front here. It has 2 mounting studs that it hangs from. One is on the inside of this frame rail, and you can clamp it down into this lower intake duct. And the other one is around front, and the opening for the air duct just tucks up under the driver's side fender here. And once that's tightened down, we'll move over to the other side. With the new horns and the alternator air duct installed on the left side, I'm going to move over to the right side and replace this bent body support bracket here. It's attached to this inside body panel by three 10mm screws accessed on the inside edge. And once it's swapped out with this replacement one, there are a few other connection points that need to be installed. There is a bracket for this power steering cooling line. Attaches here. There's also a speed clip that attaches here as a connection point for the wheel well liner. And there's another bracket for the power steering line that goes back on the radiator support bracket. And I've got all new clamps for that. And once everything is secured, we'll move on to replacing the power steering pump pulley and add in a new belt. I've got the body support bracket swapped out now and the power steering return line secured. So next I'm going to replace the power steering pump pulley and the belt with some new parts. The pulley is mounted to the end of the pump's drive shaft by three 10mm bolts, so those will need to be removed. There's a large fitting on the backside here that you may be able to get a tool on for counter leverage. I don't have one on hand that's large enough, so I'm just going to loop this old belt around the pulley and tie it off to this toe point. These V-belts provide quite a good grip, so this will work in a pinch. And with the bolts removed, the pulley can be replaced, and now the new belt can be installed. The lower front end is shaping up nicely, so I'm going to move up top to reinstall the ignition coil and the headlight motor. The ignition coil clamps in the back here by the washer fluid reservoir, and it has some electrical connections on top. The outside terminals are for the positive and negative power connections, where the black wire is positive and attaches to the post with 10mm nut, and the green ground wire attaches to the smaller post with 8mm nut. And finally, the outlet plug to the distributor cap attaches to the center connection. The headlight motor just sits in front of the coil, and it's mounted to a bracket that attaches to the top of the frame rail by two 10mm bolts, and its power connector is just off to the side here. So let's go ahead and get these two pieces in place, and then we can look at installing the new radiator and the AC condenser. Before the radiator is installed, there are a few items to care for. The first of which are these two pieces of rubber weather stripping that are installed on the inside edges of the support brackets. These provide some cushioning between the radiator and the AC condenser, and they also maintain even airflow through the center of the cooling fins on these components. There's also a stud for the AC refrigerant line clamp that needs to be installed on the left bracket. It's secured by a square-shaped nut that clips into a hole on the side of the bracket, and then the stud can be installed and tightened down. With those items out of the way, I'm going to install a new Thermo-fan switch onto the radiator. This is a dual-stage switch that engages the high and low fan speed operation, and if you look closely at the housing, you'll find the two temperature settings stamped into the part. The original cooling fan switch on this car has a 95 degree and 102 degree rating, which means the fans will kick on at low speed when the engine temperature reaches 95 degrees Celsius, and then increase to high speed at 102 degrees Celsius. What I've found is that the cooling fans rarely turn on while driving this car unless it's sitting in heavy traffic, probably because of the 83 degree thermostat installed at the water pump. The thermostats and fan switches were paired together at the factory for the various 944 models so that there was a temperature difference of approximately 10 degrees Celsius between the two, which helped maintain the ideal engine temperature. The current setup on this car is one of those factory pairings, and I haven't had any significant issues with overheating, but it can get quite hot here in the summer, so I'm dropping down to a fan switch that's rated at 92 degrees and 102 degrees, and that should work well with my 83 degree thermostat. So it's just something to consider if you're replacing your thermostat or your Thermo-fan switch, to check your existing settings and go from there. The various thermostats will all be listed under the same Porsche part number, for example, but are offered at different temperature ratings by the manufacturers. Some are set at 80 degrees, while others are set for 83, 87, etc. And if they're set too far apart from the Thermo-fan switch, the fans will rarely run, and if those are set more closely together, the fans will run more constantly. The Thermo-fan switch is installed into the threaded brass fitting on the radiator using a 29mm deep socket, and it's torqued to a value of 23 Newton meters or 17 foot-pounds, and you'll want to apply a new sealing ring whenever replacing these. Now that the new fan switch is installed, let's take a look at how the radiator is mounted into the support bracket. Here's a look at the new radiator I picked up for the car. The radiators mount up a little bit differently on the early cars with some small brackets at the top, but this is the later model design that uses two sets of rubber grommets, one set on the bottom of the radiator crossmember and one set on the top. The top set features a jam nut and bolt setup where the bolts are tightened down to compress and clamp the radiator in between the rubber grommets. So from here we can install the lower grommets into the two holes on the lower radiator support member and then slide the radiator into place on the bracket. The bottom can be tilted forward slightly so that it rests on the rubber grommets. Then the upper grommets can be installed on each side at the top, and the radiator pushed fully into the bracket so that the retaining bolts can be installed. You want to use some judgment here as these are being tightened down so that the plastic housing on the radiator isn't damaged, but get them snugged down well enough to where the radiator isn't loosely wiggling in place, and then you can lock in the jam nuts. At that point, all the coolant hoses can be reconnected and their clamps secured, along with the electrical connector for the Thermo-fan switch. I've also got a new AC condenser to install on the car, and these are positioned directly in front of the radiator. There are two rubber sleeves that install on some metal guide pins on the front of the radiator support brackets to retain the top of the condenser, and the lower mounting points feature a rubber grommet and spacer setup that is secured by a 10mm bolt on either side. So all we need to do is push the rubber sleeves onto the metal pins, and then move the condenser into position while sliding those sleeves through the two mounting holes at the top of the condenser. Once it's in place, the 10mm bolts can be installed at the bottom and tightened down. At that point, the refrigerant lines can be reconnected on the side of the condenser. There's a small foam insulation piece that fits between the two lines here and a clamp for the high pressure line on top, and it's generally a good idea to replace the O-rings at these connection points while we're here. The next thing I'm going to do is reinstall this upper air guide on the car. There are some clips along the bottom that can be pushed onto the seam of this cross member right in front of the radiator. And once those are pushed in place, there are some little spring clips that go across the top of the radiator. Get those in place. And then I'll lift the cooling fan assembly into position and get that bolted to the radiator, and we'll look at installing the front nose panel and the headlight assemblies. The headlight assembly features two pop-up headlights connected at the center by a control shaft and some linkage used to raise and lower the headlights. On the sides of each headlight bucket are some triangular brackets that act as pivot points as well as a mounting adjustment system. While these are off the car, fresh grease can be applied on the ends of the shafts prior to reinstallation. The fitment is a bit tight while installing these, but it helps if you insert the outside bracket first and then pivot the inside bracket into position while tilting the front of the headlight up slightly. And when aligning the mounting holes into position, the outside bracket faces down and the inside bracket faces backward. And once they're in place, there is a set of triangular plates for each headlight that are secured by three 10mm bolts on the outsides. So I'll get these lined up as best I can, but they may need further adjustment once the nose panel is installed. That way all the panels are flush across the top, and if that's not the case, they can be loosened up and tilted up or down slightly for a better alignment. Once the headlight buckets are tightened down and the wiring reconnected, the headlight control shaft can be installed. It slides into place behind the top of the radiator and connects to a splined shaft on the headlight motor on the right side, and is secured by a metal bracket and two 10mm bolts on the left side. After securing those connections, the two metal hinges with plastic ball bearings can be popped onto their metal balls, and the washers and C-clips installed on each side. At this point, we're ready to raise the headlights so that the nose panel can be reinstalled, so you can either use the adjustment dial on the top of the headlight motor, or turn the ignition switch to the on position, turn on the headlights, and then remove the fuse for the headlight motor before removing the key so that the headlights stay in a raised position. And now the nose panel can be reinstalled. The nose panel or the header panel simply slides onto the front of the car, and once it's in place there are 4 Phillips head screws along the top, and there are 2 Phillips head screws on the inside, one on each side. Some notches for the studs on the bottom of the panel, and some 8mm nuts to lock those in, and one final 10mm bolt on either side, tucked in the corner for the fender here. So get everything lined up and tighten down, and then you can lower the headlights. And then we can move back down below and look at the front air guide and the front spoiler. I've got the nose panel all tightened down, and I reinstalled the headlight weather stripping at the front. You can use a little bit of soapy water and these pieces will just slide right in. The next thing I'm going to do is install this center air guide in the front, and it bolts right underneath the cross member with a couple 10mm bolts, and then we'll start working on the front spoiler. Here's a breakdown of all the hardware that goes into mounting the front spoiler to the car. So if you start in the center section, there are some bolt holes on either side. Connects up to the radiator support bracket using some 10mm bolts. And if you get that center section connected first, it makes the sides a little bit easier. And these feature a metal support bracket, goes up underneath, and 3 bolts with an 8mm bolt head that go into the front fenders. There's also a center support hanger, and for some reason the hole for this wasn't drilled out at the factory, but I'll get that measured and drilled, mounted up. And once it's mounted, there is a lower air duct here as well, and it's got some speed clips on the outside edges, and it tucks underneath the front spoiler. And there's a couple of metal brackets that pass through from the top, some studs on them, under which will be a washer and 10mm lock nut. There's also a bracket that goes on the fog light housing. So it'll screw in here, and then bolts will pass through the top into these holes, which go into these holes on the radiator support bracket, which sits here. And those bolts will come in from that side, and the other ones will come in from this side. So we'll get this in place, and once it's positioned loosely, you can move it around and line it up and ensure that it's flush with the other body panels before locking it down. There are some specialized washers that have a collar on them that go into some of these mounts just to provide a little bit of support as to not crack the plastic. So I picked up a few of those, but not sure they're absolutely necessary. And there's also one final connection that connects at the bottom to the wheel well liners. And we'll get that done at the very end, and then we can install the fog lights into the front. Here we can see the front spoiler is loosely mounted up, and there's some flexibility to shift it around forward and back and side to side. So what you want to do is align the seams across the body panels and hold one of the end sections in place while tightening it down. And then when you get to the center, you may need to push or pull that in or out to align that outside seam, and the same goes with the back end. And then check your lines, make sure everything's flush. Make any adjustments that are needed, and then you're good to go. Now that the lower air guide is loosely mounted, the new fog light assemblies can be installed. If you're looking at replacing damaged fog lights, there are a number of different parts available to choose from. If the glass lens is cracked or pitted from road debris, you can save some money and replace just the lens portion of the assembly, which is secured by 2 screws recessed into the front molding. The third screw in the corner is a tilt adjustment screw that can be turned in or out to aim and better align the fog light beam pattern. If the glass lens is collecting water but is otherwise undamaged, these rubber gaskets can also be replaced as a single part to improve the sealing of the assembly. And of course, the bulbs can be replaced if they've burned out. And finally, if the entire assembly is missing or damaged, that part can be purchased as one entire unit as well. Once the lens is removed, you'll find a spring clip on the back that can be lifted to remove the fog light bulb. These use H3 halogen bulbs, and they're available as OEM Hella bulbs, along with a number of aftermarket options that come in a variety of colors. The H3 bulbs are another item that isn't polarity sensitive, but as a general practice, the white wire on the bulb is the positive, and the metal flange acts as the ground connection. Once the bulb is installed, the white wire on the bulb connects to the white wire inside the rear assembly, and the brown wire connects to the terminal on the metal cup. If we trace these wires back to the main connector, we'll find that it's marked by the numbers 1 and 2 on the base of the terminals, where 1 is the positive and 2 is the negative. And so after installing the assembly into the front spoiler, we can connect the brown wire from the wiring harness to number 2, and then depending on which side you're on, the white or the yellow positive wire will attach to number 1. With the new bulbs installed and the fog light assemblies in place on the lower front spoiler, they can be secured by the 4 mounting screws on the rear, and again, the inside connection point also secures the metal bracket for the lower air duct, and all we need to do is tighten down the screws and then align the bracket with the holes on the end of the air duct and install the 2 10mm bolts that pass into the radiator support bracket. With the fog lights installed and the lower air guide tightened down, it's time to install the side marker lights into the front spoiler. These assemblies have 2 plastic nuts on the back side that secure them in place with the help of a plastic mounting bracket. The bracket sits on the inside of the spoiler side panel, while the wiring and lens assembly is inserted through the front. Once the 2 pieces are aligned, the nuts can be installed. The electrical connector is similar to that of the fog lights in that it's marked with the numbers 1 and 2, where the brown ground wire connects to terminal 2 and the other colored wire, in this case gray, connects up to terminal number 1. When working with these lenses, you may also find that the rubber gasket that surrounds the outside lens will be damaged or missing, and while the gaskets are no longer available from Porsche, only 944.com sells them in sets of 4 to cover the front and rear markers, so I've got some of those on order to replace these ones. All the lighting for the front spoiler is installed now, so we can begin working on the aluminum front bumper. First, the bumper shocks will need to be installed, and they're inserted into the circular openings at the end of the frame rails, and then secured by 2 13mm bolts with lock washers. The mounting holes here allow for some adjustment so that once the bumper is mocked up in place, the shocks can be moved up or down prior to final tightening so that there's even panel gap across the top and the bottom. Before installing the front bumper, the front turn signal assemblies and the rubber impact strips need to be mounted, starting with the turn signals, which are secured by 3 screws. 2 of the screws thread directly into the metal bracket on the bumper, while the 3rd screw features a rectangular nut that sits on the inside. Next, the impact strips are installed into the notches cut into the bumper, and once they're properly aligned, they're secured by 2 10mm nuts. At this point, the bumper can be pushed into position on the car, and once it's resting on the bumper shocks, you can separately pull each side out a few inches to reconnect the wiring for the turn signals, and then the 19mm bolts can be installed through the holes cut on the bottom of the bumper, and these are torqued to 65 Newton meters or 48 foot-pounds. The front end rebuild is wrapping up pretty nicely, and with the fresh paint and all the new parts installed, the car's looking great. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the airflow meter and the air filter housing so that the coolant system can be pressurized and bled. That'll also be a good time to test all the lighting on the front of the car to ensure everything is working correctly. Based on the extremely poor condition of the O-rings I replaced on the 2 AC lines, I'm going to hold off on refilling the refrigerant for now until I can complete a general overhaul on the AC system with all new O-rings at each connection and maybe a new compressor and receiver dryer. But once the coolant system is squared away, we can drop the car down so that the front wheels can be removed, and then the new wheel well liners can be installed. With the front wheel removed, we can get a better look at the hardware securing the plastic wheel well liner to the car. There are a few screws along the bottom sections in the front and back of the liner that need to be removed, along with one in the upper front corner. And then there are 4 plastic nuts to remove as well. 3 of them sit along the back side and 1 is up top. Once all the hardware is removed, the plastic liner can be folded together slightly on the lower front edges to get some clearance for removal. The plastic edge runs behind the metal lip on the fender, and it takes just a little bit of flexing to work them out. With the front edges released and pulled together, the top section can then be tilted forward slightly, and then the liner can be pulled away from the car. Installation is the reverse of removal on these, so after getting the new liner installed and the hardware tightened down, the front wheel can be mounted up and the lug nuts torqued to 130 Newton meters or 96 foot-pounds. Well, that will do it for the front end rebuild on the 944, and despite the initial accident damage from the lower front impact, the car is actually in better overall condition now than it was previously, considering all the brand new OEM parts and hardware used for the reassembly. So let's take a look at the before and after results.